Well, hi guys. I'm Wendy from Franklin's Arch. We are a new group in the Franklin, Tennessee area, but we are hoping to reach many of you all over as we're looking to kind of support and counsel and create community for young queer adults all over. So we're really excited to be offering our first ever counsel. And we have Evan Richardson from New Moon Rising Wellness today with us. And I'm going to let Evan take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Thanks so much for having me. When Wendy and I were talking, kind of discussed a little bit about myself as well as just how I could hopefully provide a little bit of education, psychoeducation from a counseling perspective, and hopefully provide some tools to be able to respond to a variety of different experiences. My name is Evan Richardson. As Wendy mentioned, I use he, him pronouns, and something I wanted to speak to is just a little bit about my background. So I finished my master's of Master's of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling this past December 2023. And I focus primarily in my studies on research as far as it's concerned about sexuality, grief, adolescence, and then really particularly in the queer well-being spaces. So trying to make sure that clients who identify as queer and a variety of different spectrums of sexuality and gender can feel like they are their whole selves. And a lot of my research led me to encounter Dr. Joe Court, who is a well-respected clinician and researcher on queer client well-being. And he has a textbook on specifically the queer therapy space and how to make sure that clients who identify as queer can be supported in the therapy space. And so a lot of the presentation will come from his research in that book. And this quote particularly stood out to me. He said, having strong and healthy therapeutic attachments helps LGBTQ individuals recover the birthright of their sexuality and or gender and heal the effects of covert cultural, sexual, or gender abuse. And Dr. Court will have a lot of phrases that may say specifically sexual or sexuality, and yet in his book and some revisions he made that he wants to expand that language to include also those who identify in gender diversity as well. His experience is as a gay clinician, so therefore he recognizes his limitations. And so hopefully we'll be able to speak to that as well and provide some resources along the way. As you are listening into this conversation, I do just want to be aware of some different triggers that may come up for a variety of people. And those may be because of certain microaggressions, overt and covert abuse that may be discussed, as well as coming out and the process that carries for people, as well as grief, rejection, abandonment, neglect, and other dysregulating discussions. And then also just the complexities and beauties of existing in queer identities and intersectional factors. So this is an exercise that works out well for our conversation. It's the 4-7-8 breathing exercise. And you'll see here the way that it identifies this, bringing balance to your mind and your body, introducing this congruence from your mind running so fast. Maybe your heart rate is raised as well. Maybe you even have a little bit of sweating or some heat that you experience in your body. And taking this moment to breathe, inhaling for 4 seconds in your nose, holding for 7 seconds, and exhaling out of your mouth for 8 seconds. It allows your body to ground itself, to get integrated with yourself and slow down the mind and the body to be in congruence with one another, which is really the whole goal of therapy, is for clients to feel like a full congruence within themselves, specifically with their mind, their body, and their heart. And as Dr. Court kind of discusses in a lot of his work, is he talks about the systemic or the external factors that really affect someone's congruence in their life, specifically in the queer experience. And one of the things he talks about is this covert cultural sexual abuse, or once again, this can be used for, we could really just say covert cultural abuse for the broader queer population. But he says this is a chronic verbal, emotional, psychological, and sometimes sexual assault against an individual's gender expression and sexual feelings and behaviors. And what Dr. Court continues to go on to say is that it's similar to what we know of in sexual harassment, and that it interferes with a person's ability to function socially, psychologically, romantically, affectionately, and sexually. And it affects and persists into adulthood, even if there may be more of the experiences in childhood or adolescence. Because oftentimes when we talk about abuse, we think about much more of the physical aspects of abuse and the ways in which we've experienced harm to our bodies. Or we might even talk about emotional abuse and the way that we have experienced someone's words used against us. And this conversation about covert abuse, covert cultural abuse, is saying that there's this larger cultural system that says your gender expression or your sexuality or anything along the queer experience is not good, is not acceptable. And Dr. Court goes on to say that these messages, whether they be direct and aggressive, or they be passive and they be covert or kind of microaggressions, as we would say, they sit with us. And as many of us know within trauma research, trauma-informed care, trauma and these sort of effects do sit in our body. They stay with ourselves. And so a lot of this work that he does, Dr. Court, and some of the work that I like to do within the mindfulness space, as well as narrative work, really focuses on what are these larger narratives that are going on around us, and how do we as individuals respond to that to care for our bodies when sometimes we've been separated from our bodies. Our minds and the thoughts we've been told have kind of pulled us outside of feeling like we're safe in our bodies. And so one of the primary models that Dr. Court references and a lot of different experts within the queer therapy circles reference is this Cass model of coming out. And the stages of coming out are not necessarily like we would think in the sense of, at stage 1, you're a certain age, and 2, you get older and older and older in a linear progression. More so, they're understood that these are different parts of someone's experience in having this congruence with their queer identity. And so this may look like that confusion and then comparison happens, or maybe it jumps around with different experiences with different people. Maybe there are certain moments in our lives that trigger a reminder of a comparison moment or a confusion moment, even when we feel like we're in this pride space. And so there's this understanding that this isn't so much a linear progression, but more so this is a fuller picture on the way that we weave in and out of ourselves. And we experience this congruence with not just our expressed identities, but our internal experiences within ourselves. So this is going to be kind of the framework that I'm going with as I talk about some different resources for speaking about someone's experience, because you'll see here that we have confusion, comparison, tolerance, acceptance, pride, and synthesis. While I won't go into a lot of descriptors about each one of these stages, but I'm happy to talk about them any more that I can with individuals. More so, it's going to be kind of self-explanatory. This idea that first I'm confused because maybe what the world says I am supposed to be is not who I feel internally. And this comparison is noticing these differences within oneself and maybe within the dominant culture. The third stage may be simply acknowledging this is a part of my experience. I am different from this dominant culture, and I don't know what to do with it. Whereas the fourth stage might be more so I accept this is a part of me. I am queer. And then the fifth one is taking ownership, pride, and actually jumping into that identity and community and creating further congruence. And then synthesis is really more about external inclusion of other people within the queer community, and specifically advocacy and bringing more people alongside in this world and kind of speaking to those at different stages in the community. And so I'll talk about some different resources for each one of these to kind of maybe speak to how your experience may be felt within these certain moments as you are coming to terms with your identity. And I think it's also important for us to know that one's coming out story is never linear, and one's coming out expression and coming in terms with who they are it can look so different from one person to the next. And so there's no particular age or timeline or a specific way of being within these expressions. And I really appreciate that within Dr. Court's work, as he highlights an alternative way of considering coming out, which is the term coming in, which comes primarily from the Indigenous community. And I think it's especially important for us to highlight the intersectionalities of our identities, whether that be someone identifies as gay and identifies as Black, or identifies as queer and identifies as Indigenous, or identifies as lesbian and identifies as white. Understanding what do these intersectionalities mean for someone's life. And so Dr. Alex Wilson talks about coming in as not necessarily a declaration. It is simply presenting oneself and being fully present as an Aboriginal person who is queer. And it's more about bringing oneself in to a space, and instead of expecting the cultural dynamic to accept oneself, it is bringing oneself into that cultural space and simply being. And the way that Dr. Wilson talks about it is it likens it to this idea of not necessarily having to have acceptance from the broader cultural, but bringing a community around oneself, rather than expecting that a community would change when one comes into terms with their identity. It is instead saying, I'm going to bring a community around me that's going to come around me and come into my identity to better understand who I am. So as I kind of go through these different stages and some different resources that may be beneficial, I want to just bring those things to mind for every person's experience, to know what goes on within one's particular experience is going to be different, and that's certainly understandable. And I'll have some different resources at the end as well. So looking at the first stage, this sort of idea of confusion, it's going to be a lot about personal exploration and understanding of oneself. So you'll notice much of the resources or the guides that are being provided are not about how one goes to change a system and the way that the system has responded to them. Rather, it is, how do I as an individual empower myself and understand myself and care for myself? So that may look like internet exploration, such as understanding, what does it mean to be queer? This would be something to be careful with, especially those who are minors, and trying to be careful with different internet searches, but it's finding different internet spaces that are comfortable, that one can feel like they see themselves in the world and can identify with someone else's experience. This also looks like light exploration into queer literature and media, being able to, once again, have this modeled experience within another person's life, so that someone doesn't feel so alone, but that experience is normalized, as we say in counseling. And then also, it is a part of this understanding of the stages of coming out, not so much to understand what am I going to experience along the pathway, but rather to know this is a journey. This is not one day, no one knows this part of myself. The next day, I have to make sure everyone knows. This is a slow or fast. It's however quickly one needs it to be in order for them to feel congruent with themselves and to feel safe and taken care of. And then last, a lot of times what some clients benefit from is a gender or sexual autobiography or ecosystem, understanding what stories have been a part of my life that explain or at least speak into this part of my expression and my identity that I'm coming to terms with and that I'm embracing. What is that? And in this stage, this might not be as much about that embracing, but simply identifying and putting a name to one's experience. The next stage is this comparison stage. And so part of this comparison stage may look like being a part of certain spaces that have more queer representation, and even going to support groups such as PFLAG and interacting, or Franklin's Arch, and interacting with people who may have a similar or shared experience, simply to understand, how do I see myself in the world? There are plenty of organizations in Middle Tennessee that we're happy to provide connections with, and I know Wendy has a great repertoire of those connections for us, and we'd love to help connect any of you with those. But some of those might also look like looking at a gender or sexuality spectrum, a romance spectrum, or other documents. And I'm actually going to go to the next slide for you to see that. I really like this one that is this color wheel. And it looks like, rather than saying that one's sexual attraction is, black, white, or gray, it actually has a few different opportunities for one to feel like, I feel like I'm somewhere in between this, this red and this dark blue, or I feel like today, and really the more I've come to terms with my story, this orange and this purple, there's somewhere in between there that feels more accurate to my expression. Because as many of us are aware, we talk about this spectrum of one's experience, that putting our sexuality and or gender experiences within a binary can be really diminishing to one's experience and to the whole human connection. And so, as many people are aware, the Trevor Project has some amazing resources, and this spectrum is just one of those to talk about gender presentation, expression, identity, biological sex, as well as sexual orientation. Because when we talk about the queer experience, it is so much larger than just how one is attracted to another person in sexual or romantic ways. It's also how we connect with ourselves and the world. And so I really appreciate the Trevor Project sharing that resource. And then as we kind of continue on, some like to think about their experience within certain characters in this time of comparing their story with another who may have come out or who is experiencing this coming out. And so the book Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda, or the movie Love, Simon, is often one that can be likened to the scenario of one's comparison to this world, understanding how they fit in the world, and whether or not they move on into certain expressions of that identity, rather just simply coming to terms in that comparison stage of knowing who they are, rather than trying to fit within a specific mold. And then there's also a sexuality questionnaire that Dr. Court has provided, which is, I think, a really beneficial resource for people if they so choose. And it's simply to identify, and this is going to be kind of hard to see that, so sorry, Wendy, I can provide a different one there because that's really small font, isn't it? But this the idea of, oh, there we go. Wendy's on top of it, everyone. But this idea of asking ourselves of kind of when we recall certain moments of our experience. And this one is specifically on sexuality, because once again, that was Dr. Court's original research. And yet he and others have talked about how this could be very easily adapted for someone's identity and the gender expression. And so it's much more about how are we coming to terms? What are stories that were told to us that gave language to our experience and our identity? And what are even family messages and or school experiences that really brought into light that our experience was maybe not what we would say is the heteronormative. And then as we continue on looking at this tolerance stage, tolerance has certainly a heavy connotation, one that assumes that our identity is something that has to be managed or mitigated almost, and that there are barriers to ourselves. And yet I think that's kind of what this experience can feel like. It's not so much an embracing, it's more, this is a part of me, and I almost feel as if I have to manage certain social circles in order that I may be accepted still. I understand this is a part of me. I don't know yet who I want to know that this is a part of me. Excuse me. And so this might look like having deeper involvement with certain queer groups so that there are other people, ancestors, elders in the queer community, and or people that are peers that can identify with this experience and say, me too, I've had that experience of not knowing who was safe or when it was safe to disclose certain parts of my identity. And as well as really talking about these risks and rewards of coming out. As much as we know research talks about the challenges and the risks of staying in the quote unquote closet, as maybe old terminology says, we also understand that there are not always the greatest rewards in coming out in certain times of people's lives. And so it is really important to consider the geopolitical environment in which one lives, the region, the religious and or spiritual influences that are around that person, as well as the support system that is there, because ultimately wanting to make sure that one's well-being is taken care of as an individual, as well as they have a support system to support them when challenges come in the way, is exceptionally important in this stage, because it's already kind of this heightened aware survival mode. Once again, who is safe? Am I safe? And who can I go to for help? And then there's this really great activity that I came across in some research that's called photo voice documenting. And it can almost be as if someone was creating their own TikTok account or their own Instagram account, and they were documenting their life and the way that they experience their queer identity in the world. And this may be a picture such as someone wearing an outfit that feels like that really expresses their gender identity, or maybe it is someone where they see a piece of art that just speaks to their sexuality, or maybe it's someone that they take a picture of nature that speaks to this particular part of their queer identity that just connects them with themselves. And it's almost creating a photo album or some sort of documentation of someone's queer experience, so that they can speak to and see this evidence of where they feel congruent with themselves, kind of externalizing the experience that's going on internally, noting what feels safe, congruent, and whole in those moments, and documenting them. And that can speak to a lot of the mindfulness work that I really find myself doing in therapy, which is taking moments of gratitude of when one feels themselves and when one feels aligned and whole in those moments. Additionally, as we kind of talk through this experience, when one comes to the stage of acceptance, this actually brings, as we were talking about that mitigation with the tolerance, this is going to bring up maybe a little bit more of that rubbing against certain spaces within which one has been able to express themselves in a certain capacity, and they're now choosing to express themselves in their more congruent capacity. And so grief is going to be a really common experience throughout all of these stages. And this one is probably going to be the moment within which grief is experienced the most with an external response. And so we talk about different grief models. Some like to think about the stages of grief from Kubler-Ross, which is certainly acceptable. I really like to talk about in my grief work the dual process model of grief, and I'll look at that in just a little bit, and understanding a little bit about the ways in which we experience both joy and grief in our experience. And really a lot of what's going on in this moment is that cost analysis, is thinking in any change, which expressing oneself in full congruence is going to be change, there will be loss. Change is not always negative. Loss is not always negative. It may, in fact, in losing one thing, another may be gained. And so it really is doing these pros and cons of coming out and what has already begun in the process of one's congruence with oneself. And then one activity, which would be more of a creative arts expression, is this creative closet project. And once again, the term of the closet can seem really old and ancient in a lot of ways. And yet for some people, this is really a beautiful way for them to describe themselves of, I felt like I was closed up in my old experience of life, and I don't want to feel like there is a lock on my experience anymore. I want to feel like I can experience the entire world with who I am. And so oftentimes in this activity, I recommend for clients to draw what they experience in their closet. What from their childhood do they feel like is stuck and trapped in there? What do they want to leave in their closet? And what are they sad that they're going to have to leave in their closet, or they're choosing to leave in their closet? And what would they like to take with them? What do they want to be on the outside of the closet as well? Understanding this both and, this joy and this grief, that I will choose that I may leave some things in the closet, and there are some that I will both gain and I will take with me. And so that brings me back to this idea of the dual process model of grief, which comes from Strobe and Shute, who did a study on the grief process, and they came to really this terminology, dual process model, as understanding that grief may not be experienced in that linear ideal that Kubler-Ross talked about, which she's even come back to say that grief is not linear, and she that was not her intent in her work. And yet this process seems to be one in which more people can more easily connect to their grief experience. You'll see on the left this loss orientation, this idea of thinking about the loved one or maybe the experience that you're no longer bringing with you into this full congruence of yourself, focusing on your life before, as it says. And yet you'll also see this joy orientation of what you're gaining. What are new traditions or maybe new relationships that you've gained in this full congruence with yourself? And you'll even notice this sort of adjusting family roles, which may look like this is an idea of maybe your family really is changing as a whole, or maybe you take on a new role within a family system, whether that be biological or that be chosen family. And yet it really comes back to this idea, as the well-known social worker Brene Brown says, grief and joy can be held hand in hand. And so understanding in this acceptance that I am accepting this is a part of me, and I know that there's going to be some cost in this choice of fully being congruent with myself. And then the second to last stage, this pride stage, this is when expression tends to go a lot more externally in this stage. And so this looks like advocacy in some aspect for a lot of people. Maybe that be showing up in spaces and wanting to care for those who are not at a place where they feel as congruent with themselves, as well as speaking to the shame that's underlying within that covert cultural abuse and the ways these narratives have taken a hold of one's identity, and understanding this concept of disenfranchised grief, which is a grief that is not culturally accepted in the same way that a traditional or a typical loss grief is. One's coming out story or congruence within their queer identity is understanding I have lost certain things that a dominant culture doesn't recognize as loss. And so coming to terms with that, and maybe even gaining some different resources and tools, and then engaging with different queer health resources, specifically affirmative care, for people that need a particular type of care for themselves, and even more preventative care as well, whether that be in sexuality spaces or suicide prevention. As we know, there is a heightened suicide risk for people who identify as queer, and a lot of that comes from the shame and the cultural abuse that occurs for themselves. And so recognizing those sort of specific resources that are available for different people. And these shame practices, as I mentioned in that last slide, they particularly come from the conversation between Matthias Roberts, who is a author and psychotherapist, and he does a lot of work on the queer experience, as well as Linda K. Klein, who is an author, and she's a founder of an organization called Break Free Together, which focuses on supporting individuals healing from gender and sexuality-based religious trauma specifically. And these are different shame practices that they gather through their research and through their conversation to really speak to that congruence of oneself. Just Say Yes talks about, if you've ever seen the world-renowned Yes Man movie with Jim Carrey, it's truly saying yes to yourself and doing so in a way that says, I can trust me. I can trust my opinions. I can trust my feelings, and I can be safe for myself. And of course, I'm being careful in that to know the harm that we're not also inflicting on other people. And then also this senses self-date, engaging with one's senses in a way of noticing smells that are really appealing, eating good food that feels like it is something that you get to choose and be a part of yourself. Oftentimes, once again, this congruence pulls our minds, or incongruence pulls our minds away from our bodies. And so in reclaiming and becoming congruent with oneself and their queer experience, it comes to term, it has this idea of coming to terms with, I want this, and I enjoy this sense, this taste, this feeling, and I'm going to connect to that. As well as a senses collage. And this may look like some sort of, once again, kind of like that photo voice, gaining some sort of document of all the things that are in this maybe full congruence or this growing congruence of oneself that you notice that you enjoy. And documenting those things, speaking sort of gratitudes and intention behind those good good experiences that you have. Ashamed action is one that I would suggest is best done within a therapeutic support. This speaks to specific shamed experiences and or behaviors of oneself, that it's speaking directly against those experiences and behaviors in such a way that you are actually able to overcome that shame. And it creates, because shame creates silence, whereas this is an idea of trying to do something within you, getting that incongruence with yourself, incongruence with community. So reaching out to another in a therapeutic relationship, speaking to that shame, engaging within that behavior that is healthy, is not harmful, and yet there's been these shame narratives around it, allows for that shame to be diminished. Shame creates silence, and in this congruence, we're wanting to empower that voice that's been silenced within you. And then lastly, this sort of punch card. And this is also one that may be best done in a therapeutic space, within understanding what are things within my incongruence when I did not feel whole, that I didn't think I could do, or I didn't think I could be. And maybe creating some small activities that feel realistic and also specific and measurable, so that you can attain these moments of, identifying and deciding what this looks like to fully come into terms with yourself and speak to those shame narratives that you've had. And lastly, we have stage 6, and this is the synthesis stage. And this is really looking at, maybe this looks like relationship mending, things that have been broken over time. Oftentimes, I know I've had clients that have said that they've distanced people in their coming out story, not because they weren't people that were willing to support them, but because of projections that person felt like they were putting on that relationship. Maybe it looks like family restructuring or reconstruction or resolution. That looks different for every person, of course. And then community involvement. Once again, oftentimes within the queer identity, we talk about this way in which people, when they have experienced full congruence, they want to give back to the community so that others can feel that safety and congruence with themselves. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of my work that I've experienced in my life and within my therapeutic work has been in mindfulness and narrative work. And so I want to kind of look at some different resources that may be helpful for you. Wellness That Works is a book by Dr. Denise Thomas, and she talks about some very specific and measurable ways to introduce self-care in your life. And she actually has a 30-day plan of trying to introduce certain practices that can be really beneficial to you. And you'll see this self-care bingo that comes from on-site counseling and their sort of way of engaging. Maybe this is something you can do to think, okay, how have I taken care of myself? Did I get outside today? Probably not today if you're in Nashville, Tennessee in late August, because it's been really hot. But did you drink water? Did you journal? Did you call a friend? How did you connect? And how did you connect with yourself? And how did you get that congruence going? Not your mind and your body separating and your emotions separating, but how did they come together? As well, mindfulness CBT. I spoke to the 478 breathing, which is one that I use for myself in so many times of life, as well as I introduce to clients. This hand tracing is one that technically comes from dialectical behavior therapy, and it's this idea of breathing in when you go up in your finger and breathing out when you go down, and just simply going as slow as you can within this space to bring yourself back together. This idea of, once again, getting our nervous system re-engaged with our mind, our body, and our emotions. And then lastly, this grounding kit. This is one that I find exceptionally beneficial for people, once again, that their bodies haven't always felt like they've been safe. They haven't been able to express their desires or what they really like in the world, and actually creating almost like a mobile kit. Maybe it's 5 little pictures, or maybe they're little toys that express some part of yourself. Maybe there's a piece of chocolate in there that you really like, or maybe there's some essential oil, or maybe a little bit of a flower or some sort of perfume that is a good smell that you enjoy, and maybe having some songs or some noises on hand that are always soothing yourself, so that when our senses get overwhelmed by this cultural noise and this external noise, that we're able to bring ourselves back together, to remind ourselves that we are safe and we are good. And then lastly, this narrative timeline is one that I really enjoy for clients, because if you're an avid reader, we know that books and stories can be a great way for us to get to identify with someone's story and to be able to see ourselves in the world. And so this is really our way of understanding, how do I understand the stories that have come around my life that have influenced who I am today? What of those stories do I want to take with me? What of those stories do I want to have some rewriting to? And you'll see that this can be broken up into different chapters to be able to combine themes or notice certain commonalities within your experience that may then also speak to this last chapter, which is Into the Future, which talks about, where do I see myself going? Where would I like to go in the future? And I think it's a beautiful way of, once again, this congruence of oneself to say, I've had these experiences. I can't necessarily change those experiences, but I get to say how those stories have influence on my life. I get to say what story I want to continue writing. And so lastly, as any good counselor or therapist would, I have to quote Mr. Rogers, because it wouldn't be good if I wasn't. And Mr. Rogers, he says this, which I think is one of the most beneficial mantras that I like to say for myself and to say for others, which is, you are a very special person. There's only one like you in the whole world. There has never been anyone exactly like you before, and there never will be again. And this reminder to ourselves that we are a whole person, we have diverse experiences within ourselves, and coming back to ourselves so that we can feel safe, seen, soothed, and secured, as attachment therapy talks about, and really feeling whole and well so that we can connect with the world and be our full selves. My last slide that I wanted to provide is simply this list of resources for anyone that may want to know some of the resources that I engage with in this process. And then I know that, of course, Wendy has a million different resources through Franklin's Arch and her connections that she can certainly provide for you. And if I can be of any assistance to anyone and support in their journey to being congruent and well, I would love to be. And so, yes, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for putting my email up there. That's my email for my counseling work that I get to do as an associate counselor with New Moon Rising Wellness. And I'm really grateful and honored to be able to experience this journey with so many people and get to hear their stories so that I can support them wherever they are in their walk. And if I can be of any support to you, please do not hesitate to reach out. And a big thanks to Wendy for having me.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. The information is like, whew, so good. I made took all these notes. I really love that you were saying how it's not a linear process coming out. And I think sometimes that expectation for some people feels like, okay, well, if I know this about myself, why can't I just jump right to like the acceptance, or, even the advocacy, or all these different, stages of it, that it's a process. And what was interesting when you were talking about the 6 stages, being a mom of a queer child, but not somebody from the community, I actually was like, wait, I've gone through those stages too. First, like, kind of going, okay, this is new news. And then also saying, okay, where are the safe spaces for me to talk about this? Who's safe to talk about my child with? And then getting to the point of like that prideful point of wanting to, be more outspoken and be, like, where can I do any activism work or things like that. So it's really interesting because I'm like, wow, I get that. I feel like there are some stages that loved ones can go through versus they're watching, their kids or friends or partners or whoever through the process. So that was pretty cool too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, the more that we know about the people that we love, the more that we grow along with them as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, really good. Thank you so much. I'm going to pop up here too that there's Newman Rising Wellness's Instagram to follow along. And obviously for Evan to reach out, the email was there. And truly, this is so awesome to have this resource. And this is the goal, is to just give these tools and this information to these queer individuals, young adults, whoever reaches us. It's absolutely fine. We just want to let people know that they're supported, that there is community out there, and lots of love is out there, and you are not alone. And again, thank you so much for being our first counsel ever for Franklin's Arch.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, and hope that the resource can be beneficial for all who engage. So thanks for all the work that you're doing, Wendy, and the amazing support that you're creating for people to make sure that they can feel cared for, loved, and whole as people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.